And now we have the last talk by Zhen Zong from Tsinghua Laboratory for Brain and Intelligence, Tsinghua University, Beijing. And he's just being wired up. Okay, floor is yours.
Hello. This one. Okay, good. Hello. Can people hear me? Okay. Yeah. Very glad to be here and giving the last talk. I hope will be interesting to you. So basically, what I will talk about is basically how do we build multi-scale models towards artificial intelligence. And that's a lofty goal. So before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about our institute. So I'm from Tsinghua University from Beijing. And actually, we established in 2013 a center called Brain-Inspired Computing. So the idea is that we need to integrate basic brain science perspective and computer science perspective. In computer science, there's a really good theories and system hierarchies for being able to do computation. While in the brain, we have not figured out, I guess, all the basic principles yet, but obviously potential advantages. So we thought, the best idea then to combine them, hopefully train next generation students that are proficient in both, and that will be able to actually build a similar system hierarchy and a theoretical framework for brain-inspired computing. So as you can see, one of the difficulty in building these kind of systems is because the brain has many scales, right? So I took this figure from Teresinovsky's famous book. You can see that in order to understand the brain, we have to start from angstrom level molecules, right? And then go all the way to the whole system. And the problem is that in neuroscience, unlike in physics, these scales are not really well separated, right? I just give a simple example. You drink coffee, which is a molecule, right? And it affects your cognition, which is at the top of the hierarchy. Also, you have a large diversity of neuron types, as you can see. So it makes it really difficult to actually come up with unified theories. And I think before we actually go and attempt at really unified theories, we should first not pretend that we have unified elements, right? And really understand these diversities first. Then maybe work from there to try to come up with unified theories. And another way to kind of understand this framework is from using David Marr's tri-level kind of framework to try to understand this. So in this, he talks about 3 different functional levels, right? On the highest level is the goal. Like whenever you study this system, right, because it's a computation system, you have to understand what it's trying to do. In the middle level, you have the algorithmic level, right? How these are actually implemented. Then in the bottom level, this is the implementational level, how you actually implement these particular kind of algorithms on the physical devices. And again, here in neuroscience, often the levels are not as well separated as in traditional computer science, right? So that also makes it difficult. But anyway, so I try to formalize these ideas a little bit into these kind of hierarchies to just guide our thinking, right? So on the left is really well defined. On the computational goal level, you have this operating system showing at each instance what you want to do. And then on the algorithm level, you have these standard libraries, right, which is a collection of known algorithms. And on the implementation level, then you have monolithic architecture, integrated circuit design, as many talks address here. And the important thing is that we have an overarching principle here, which is the Turing machine, right? This allows you to be able to convert between these levels and not worry about the other levels too much, right? Be able to have a consistent theory. In deep learning, I think we're starting to get to that stage because we have the backpropagation algorithm. On the highest level, we see these aging frameworks. In the middle level, we started to have large pre-training models, then you on the implementation level, based on the backpropagation, you have the computational graphs. Right? You can worry out just how to accelerate running computational graphs, and it should work for the other levels. Yeah, we're not yet for brain-inspired models. So we have what to look for up to, which is the brain. And I would argue the overarching principle is not really clear, except that evolution is probably important. Then the goal level, is typically studied by cognitive science. The algorithm level, I would say, mostly studied by system neuroscience and neurocircuits field, while on the implementation level, we have cellular and molecular neuroscience. So I think then on the right, which is the brain-inspired AGI type of work, then we try to learn from the different levels of the brain and hope to finally arrive at the hierarchy similar to what we have in computer science and deep learning. Okay, so I'll talk about two topics, which is the brain-inspired learning rules and the cognitive framework in this talk. So basically, SDDP has been referred to a lot in this conference, which was I guess discovered by Henry Markram, and then Guo Changbi and Mumin Pu started to draw these really nice curves. And then after you draw in the full curve, what's come out as very surprising is that there's a really sharp transition at time 0, right? So Guo Chang emphasizes that this is actually very close to Hebb's original idea, because having this time difference makes us to emphasize that you have to be causal, right? Not just correlational, which is actually what Hebb originally intended. While if you have acausal situations, you actually get a depression rather than potentiation. So I worked on this as my PhD thesis with Professor Larry Abbott to try to explain what this can do. And one thing we found clearly is that this is actually a very competitive Hebbian learning rule. Right? So for example, on the left, you have one neuron receiving a lot of inputs. And on the right, what you can see is actually, look at the situation D, that even you have two kind of inputs which are correlated within each other, but not correlated with each other, but uncorrelated with each other, but correlated within each group. What you see is actually you have a very competitive situation that actually one of the group wins, right? So the competitive nature is actually what's really characteristic about this learning rule. Of course, Professor Wolfgang Gerstner's lab made similar observations at that time. I was very got into this field of neuromorphic engineering once I saw these kind of great papers showing that memory cells can actually emulate the synapse. And really, I was very encouraged by Professor William Stanley to actually come back to my PhD thesis type of work to investigate more of these kind of computational rules for neural-inspired computing. Okay, so actually competitive SDDP coincides actually with the critical period. So it turns out in the brain, actually, it turns out initially you just use normal Hebbian learning to kind of wire up the whole brain so information can get through first. And then there's a critical period where you actually does a lot of pruning, right? You want to learn specific information. And that's where actually SDDP is really most important. And then basically, the basic SDDP actually disfavors reciprocal connections. And so there has been a lot of work to reconcile this with traditional Hebbian learning, where you actually see a lot of reciprocal connections. For example, in hippocampal, you actually have these symmetric curves. So actually, you do see this. And also in the cortex, it's later found that SDDP actually depends on the frequency, right? So you can actually, using these kind of examples from these triplet learning rules, you can actually infer both. So you can keep the SDDP time difference, and you can actually, for example, on the right, you can see that if you have just constant, if you just have constant parents, right, which by SDDP shouldn't give you anything, but then you observe this frequency-dependent effect, which is was described by rate-based Hebbian rules. And there has been theories showing that you can actually interconvert between these. So I think these collective work actually gives a good foundation on what SDDP does in a kind of developing brain situation. The other thing that SDDP is really great is it's because it can learn temporal sequences, right? So if you on the right, if you have just a bunch of temporal sequences coming in, because of SDDP, right? You tend to move the response of the post-synaptic neuron to an earlier and earlier time. Using that kind of mechanism, you actually learn sequences. And this is actually a perfect copying kind of mechanism that's in the brain. So basically, what happens is that when you're resting, when you're not active, either you're idling or you're sleeping, actually there are like these really high frequency waves going on in your brain, right? You actually replace your experience in the previous period at a very compressed time scale, right? This very compressed time scale is actually great for SDDP because it's around 100 hertz, so the time window is around 10 milliseconds. So this is probably actually, what your brain uses to copy information from one area of the brain to another, right? In computers, this is trivial. You just copy. But in the brain, actually, you probably need this kind of mechanism to copy information. Okay. Actually, in the adult, actually, SDDP, rather than kind of freely operating like we showed in the development period, is regulated very tightly by neuromodulation. So basically, you have to have a third factor, for example, dopamine, right, which is kind of used a lot for reward in the brain. Then actually, you can change the curve completely, as shown on the left, and also change the efficacy of these SDDP. So you can use neuromodulation to modulate it. Okay, so that gives a good foundation of kind of unsupervised learning in the brain. But then what about supervised learning, right? So we have been really fascinated by the great progress made in deep learning over the past few years. So there has also been a lot of talks at this conference about how to reconcile them, right? So basically the idea is that in backpropagation, you actually backpropagate a vector of errors. So it's kind of like you try to estimate the gradient, then you make a change in the direction of the gradient, right? But there are a lot of reasons why backpropagation is slightly different from what's happening in the brain, probably, because in the original version of backpropagation, it requires a bidirectional synapses, and you need very high precision to encode the gradients, right, which are kind of not easy to do in the brain, right? Okay. The situation actually gets a lot worse if you talk about backpropagation time, right, which is used to learn sequences in a recurrent neural network, because this will require you to store all of these intermediate values of the brain, of the neuron, right, if you want to apply BPTT, and that just doesn't seem to be very many good ways of doing that. Okay. So the question is, actually, can we design the training method for SNN that bypasses the need for gradients without compromising too much the performance, right? That would be kind of a very good target. So I'll show that actually yes in some cases. So the idea is that we actually go back to a simpler way of training these networks, which is kind of a zeroth order method, right? You actually just, what happens is that if you learn a deep learning course, they tell you about the gradient checker, right? So basically, like you just perturb your input by a little bit, and you see how much it changes on the output, right? So that's kind of like a numerical way of computing the gradient. They tell you that it's not as efficient as propagation, of course, but I'll show that it actually works in some cases. Okay, so basically, in this work, we were inspired by this paper from OpenAI, evolutionary strategies. So basically what they do is that instead of evaluating the gradient explicitly through backpropagation, right, what you can do is you can try an evolutionary type of strategy where you generate a lot of variants, and then you keep the best alternatives, right? So basically, you don't compute the gradient directly using backprop, but you approximate the gradient from sampling, right? Can we do a similar thing for SNN? Actually, so this is what we tried. So basically, we do sampling-based learning, then we use a simple recurrent spiking neural network in the middle, right? Then you have some input and some output. It's a little bit similar to the reservoir computing framework, except we try to learn the reservoir, right? Then actually, we try to restrict the connections to be 1 bit, right? So that's a kind of an extreme situation, which makes it very easy to run on neuromorphic chips, actually. Then we actually try to do some non-trivial tasks, which are these kind of simulated tasks which are kind of standard tasks for deep learning algorithm, for reinforcement learning algorithms. And what we do is actually, okay. What we do is actually, so basically we try to sample the connections at each time step. So at each time step, we look at that synapse, right? And we sample a 0 or 1. So basically connected or not connected, depending on the hidden variable theta, which is kind of a little bit like your weight, but it's really more like the release probability of a synapse, if you think about it. So basically the chance that you become 1 or 0. Right. So basically, basically what then you do is you try to pair that with the reward you get. So basically, if you sample the 1 on the past trial and you got a reward, then you want to increase the chance that you will become a 1 next time, right? So increase the theta, which will be kind of the release probability. So it's a really like simple learning rule, right? So basically, you just generate Bernoulli samples of 0 and 1s each time, and use that to estimate your gradient, and you move kind of in the direction of the estimated gradient. Okay, so to our surprise, it actually worked pretty well for these not too simple simulated robotic locomotion tasks. And you can see the performance is actually better than most AN and SM-based baselines and more stable, right? So actually, if you look at it on the, between our orange curve and these purple curves, what you can see is actually that the Bernoulli sampling we use in this kind of evolution of conductivity approaches seems to be better actually in many cases than the Gaussian noises that people normally use when they use these kind of strategies. So basically, this kind of very simple algorithm is very easy to implement in neuromorphic chips. So we made some estimates based on Loehe kind of specs. And you can see if you use integer operations, basically integer number of neurons, and you have 1-bit connections, and then actually the cost of training this compared to using deep learning on current GPUs is about 100 times lower. Okay. So actually, one thing you might immediately ask is actually, do you need many parallel samples, right? For example, it's highly inefficient in principle because they have to generate a lot of parallel samples, and maybe together that estimates the gradient. Actually, the answer is in many practical cases, no. You only need like 16 to 32 samples in our hands to be sufficient. And the reason is that because the mini-batch stochastic gradient itself, compared to a full batch, actually introduces noise to the gradient, right? So really, how big your batch needs to be. Of course, you can have a large batch and you approach the true gradient, but it's very slow. So so there's some theories about what's a reasonable batch size to do sufficient smoothing of the gradient. And actually, it turns out it's related to how smooth the gradient is, right? Which is kind of an empirical question. So basically, it turns out that we can also do a similar estimation for our zero-order sampling approaches. So basically, you add another term, so for example, the B1 term will be kind of noise according to your sampling approach, rather than using the backpropagation MA to estimate the gradient. And the B2 term will be kind of your noise induced from this mini-batch stochastic gradient descent approaches, right? Then it turns out actually, since there's so much noise from the mini-batch gradient descent anyway, that for many practical problems, actually, if you use like an N of 16 or 32, the noise level is comparable to the noise level induced by these procedures, and you actually do okay. The other question is this biologically realistic? It turns out actually my postdoc advisor, Sebastian Sun, published a paper way back showing that you can use the stochastic synaptic transmission. So basically, whenever a spike arrives, the presynaptic spike, sometimes in many synapses in the brain, especially in the cortex or in hippocampus, the spike will actually fail to transmit, right? So you have stochastic transmission. And you can use this as a source of noise to do this kind of a ballooning sampling shown here. But of course, this is not like a drop-in placement for backprop yet. For example, if we try to test this on really simple MNIST. You can see actually for 3 layers, right, which is the minimal MLP, it actually does okay. But once you go one more layer, the performance actually drops, right? While for backpropagation, of course, the performance is better. So it's probably not great for these kind of deep networks. But we still need to explore a little bit more on what kind of situations this kind of a simple learning rules are good enough. And there's some encouraging news that it might actually work for fine-tuning very large transformer models. So I'm showing one paper in the literature that uses a similar strategy. Our initial experience with our learning rule is also quite positive. So there's a possibility that for actually these really large models, we're kind of in a different regime than these small MLP type of models, that the landscape of the gradient descent is sufficiently smooth that such a simple learning rule can actually work, right? So if we speculate a little bit, maybe that the brain first came up with this kind of simple learning rule, then it evolved structures that kind of goes together with this kinds of learning rules, right? Because our brain is not exactly a deep neural network, right? It has many shortcuts, and it's probably more similar to a recurrent neural network situation. Yeah, so I think I would encourage people to kind of look into these kind of simple learning rules and kind of really draw the boundaries on which tasks this is useful for, and I think that's very interesting to explore. Okay, so in the remaining time, I'll switch gear a little bit, talk about another different level, which is the cognitive level. Here I'm collaborating with actually the cognitive scientists at our institute to work on kind of human level problems. So if we look at the brain at a large scale, this is actually been studied a lot in cognitive neuroscience. And we can see the brain is actually quite modular, right? So what they do is they have you do different tasks, and they look at which areas of the brain are actually active. And based on that kind of tests, they can lump them into different networks, right, which are shown by different colors here. Then recently, people started to study, is there also a kind of organization within these kind of networks, right? So modular, and how these modules relate to each other. It turns out the first principal gradient shown actually by the arrows here actually goes from these unimodal networks. Right, so basically, primary visual cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, etc., to these transmodal networks, right? And also the sensory networks have very short time scales, while the transmodal networks have longer time scales. So that seems to be kind of a natural hierarchy people starting to find out on these large scales, right? So I show here also a recent framework proposed by Jan LeCun on his approach to how to get to AGI, right? So he thinks that actually some kind of modularity is probably important. So in my lab, we started to try to relay these kind of computational requirements of modules to actual brain networks. For today's talk, I will actually talk about one thing that we start to do, which is abstract rule learning. So this is actually a weak spot for deep learning at this point, right? So on the bottom right, we see Gary Marcus, who has been a critic for deep learning for a long time. He's a developmental psychologist, and his basic main argument is that even babies can learn simple rules like these, right? For example, are these two socks the same or not? Right? What is the pattern in these kind of pictures, right? While you can actually figure out the rules behind this, right? As in same or different, or ABA, versus ABB, these kind of sequences, rather than be too specifically tied to what that actual picture is. Okay. So to give a simple example, right? For example, we just want to learn the equality rule, which says fx equals x, right? And for humans, what we do is we'll give you 0, 0, 1, 0, and we'll tell you the output is 0, 0, 1, 0, right, etc. Then quickly you see the pattern, right? Oh, it's an equality rule. That's easy. So next time I ask you 0, 0, 1, 1, then the typical human response will be 0, 0, 1, 1, because you learned the rule. But of course, if you understand how deep learning works, typically the output from a deep neural network will be like 0, 0, 1, 0, right? The reason is I had not seen anything that ends in 1. It has only seen things that ends in 0. So it tries to find you the answer from the closest thing it has seen, right? So it has not learned to abstract away from the particular pattern, right, to get into the rule that's behind it. Okay, so actually is a way to actually try to do this abstraction, right? As I just showed, that rule learning actually in really young infants is fine. So even in babies that are really young, before they even learn to speak, right? They can do this test, right? The actual trick they used to do this experiment is they play these sounds, the two different alternative on different sides of the baby, and the baby will actually turn at the direction of the sound that's kind of interesting to them, right? So they can detect these kind of violations in these patterns, and they find it interesting, so they actually look at it. Right. This is before the learning of language, right? So in a sense, learning of these kind of simple rules, the system probably matures and predates the full language system, where actually you can have abstract symbols and manipulate them and combine them in arbitrary ways. So there are probably 2 stages of the abilities. Okay. In monkeys also, people find single neurons in PFC that can encode abstract rules, in this case, same or different. Right, so simple rules you can find in animals. Another example of a harder rule will be this kind of Raven-style progressive matrices, right? For example, you have to figure out the rule that fits with the rule on the top 2 rows, right? The third row. It's actually using IQ tests, right? Which means not all humans can solve it very effectively. So you can have very different levels of rules. Okay. Then I have to show that for large language models, this is still not solved, despite some of the claims. What happens is that initially people got very excited and published papers saying this is solved, but then they figure out that's because the answer is on the internet, right? So if you generate new examples, you cannot do it. Okay, so it's not a solved problem. So some of the thinking in the field now to how to solve it is that we have to put in a kind of a bottleneck, which is specific to inducing relationships, right? So this is a recent review from Trends in Cognitive Sciences. And I'll give you some examples of how we start to do these kind of things. So it turns out for the neural network reasoning community, what's called a relation network is actually really a starting point for a lot of this. So basically what this is, it does a very simple thing, right? So it just basically concatenates 2 images. If you want to induce what's the relationship between these 2 images, then it passes through some MLP neural networks, right? So so it uses kind of maybe the prior as you want, that comparison is important when learning rules. We also see this in babies, right? In order to use a rule, they have to look at one picture first, look at another picture, back and forth several times, right? To put in a sense to figure out what the relationship is. Okay, but we'll see as I'll demonstrate to you soon that this is not really good enough yet of a bottleneck. So basically, in this actual work, what we do is that we give them this task. So basically, you give an input image and you give a choice. Then basically, you want to complete the first image with a symbol, right? So that'll be one of the choices, and you choose them. And then the trick is that I don't tell you what the rule is in this case. You learn it by trial and error, right? So if you got the right, you get a reward. If you didn't get it right, you don't get a reward. And I also, in order to make this task a little bit more interesting, we actually investigate different situations. So either the Halos task will be which image it is, or the 3 token combination will be the ABB kind of rules that we showed previously. And we also try to use heterogeneous rule tasks, right, where you have different ones, and you can, for rotation, etc., simple image manipulations, you can even combine them. And the previous work we relied on is kind of the meta-learning framework for these kind of rules. So basically, in this case, the inner loop, which is a little bit like the in-context learning of large language models, basically, through an iterative process, right, tries to figure out what the rule is. while the outer loop is kind of reinforcement learning of the synaptic weights, right? And in this beautiful paper by Jian Wang in Nature Neuroscience, they showed that they can use this kind of framework for simple rules like the Hallows rule, which is basically which picture it is that's rewarded on the screen. So we try to extend this. So basically in this work, we actually take the contrasting model a little bit similar to the relation network. Then we actually add a explicit rule model, rule embedding, right? This is kind of our main difference from previous work. As you can see in the relation network work, they try to be as much learned as possible. So they say, everything has to be learned by these MLPs. While here, we actually put in a bottleneck in a sense to say that the rule should be represented by a vector, right? And the way we detect whether it's the same rule or not, you just use a simple dot product, right? So you have to induce a rule from these pictures. Then you have to be exactly agree with the rule you have in your mind. And turns out, actually, our rule is very good to this generalization type of tasks, right? For example, we can either generate to new images, or you can even actually generate to kind of new rules, right? So, for example, you have seen AAAB. We have not seen ABB rule. Can you also do it, right? You can see that our model is much better for generalizing to new rules than a lot of existing models, right? And it actually turns out, if you look at the rule embedding, since we have an explicit rule embedding, it actually starts to form these clusters for different rules. So you can imagine that from here, if you take these clusters, you can actually go into more like abstract symbolic representations. And actually, it turns out this dot product is absolutely essential for getting this to work. So we try to put back the old style of relation network, right? If you put an MLP there, and it just completely fails, right? So this bottleneck is, to our surprise, is actually the secret to this type of networks. Okay, so we also generalize it to a different situation where no explicit feedback is given. Then here, you actually, like humans, you have to do internal rewarding, right? You do internal generations. So the task we use here is this Raven-style progressive matrix tasks, right, which are much harder, as I mentioned. And basically, in the deep learning literature, there are kind of several strategies of solving this, right? So the one on the left is probably kind of the hardest, and most similar to humans, will be actually you try to search for the rule, like if you really follow the instructions on the IQ test, right? You look at the first row and say, oh, this is a rotation, right? Then you know how to generate the second row, right? But normally what people do is the one on the right. What they do is they actually cheat a little bit in a sense. So they put in these different choices. Then they kind of just look at it holistically, right? You can do it with a neural network or something. And say, oh, this looks right or not, right? You get a score for each choice. They just choose the best one, right? So basically, to cut a long story short, if you use the most holistic, kind of neural way, right, on the right, you can actually do it, right? So people were very happy. But except the problem is, it's kind of similar to the large language model story, right? If you try to change it to a different symbol or anything like that, right, as explicitly tested by this procedurally generated matrices rule, it completely fails, right? So you cannot do generalization. Okay, so we say, okay, can we actually go back to the human way of doing it, right? So we actually explicitly try to induce a rule, right, using similar procedure as shown by in the previous work. Then the difference is that because we don't have a sequence of rewards anymore, what you do is you actually use the first two rows, right? You just kind of blank out some of them and try to apply your rule to see whether it works, right? So it's kind of like an internal generation procedure. But by doing this, you want to make sure that your rule actually can generalize to different situations. And it turns out, actually, that some still work pretty well. So we improve by a large margin on these hold out the generalization cases. Okay, so the next step in this work, I think, then will be actually try to actually go one beyond step, right? So this will be kind of like a baby at like 6 months old, right? But once, a little bit later, he starts to learn language, then he starts to form a language of thought, right? So he can combine these rules in many different ways to generate new rules, etc. So I think that will be the next step, right? So in the literature, this is so-called vector symbolic representations, which use high dimensional random vectors to encode these kind of symbols, and then you can combine them using very well-defined rules, right? But the problem with that approach so far is that you have to kind of come up with these kind of rules before, right? You cannot really learn it. So in our lab, we're kind of starting to try to see whether this kind of learning approaches with the bottlenecks can be connected to those kind of approaches. And also we can borrow ideas from the hippocampal navigation system from the brain, which of course got the Nobel Prize. Okay, in the remaining few seconds, I just want to speculate a little bit about some interesting directions that I see going forward. So this actually relates kind of to the middle level in this diagram. So basically what you can see is that there has been an idea that's been around for a long time, and people really haven't completely got it to work with computational systems yet, which is that the brain might live near some kind of phase transition, so a kind of edge of chaos idea. So basically, the different states in your brain that you can, from everyday life, right? When you're sleeping, you're kind of very orderly, but you cannot do much. And when you're kind of a little bit drunk, and then you have a lot of creative ideas, right? But it's not kind of very ordered. So roughly, the brain seems to be oscillating through these states, of course. But again, in most of our normal life, it seems to be near this phase transition point between these two extremes, right? And this has some signatures in brain, in basically the brain activity patterns, which is correlations that drop off slowly with a long tail, powerless tail when you go to more distant areas. Also, if you look at the connectivities of the brain, you see these long tail log normal distributions in many, many places, right? So this is related, of course, to complex systems theories, right? So how do you actually get this to work to reconcile this with the models we was just talking about? Right, I think it will be quite interesting. Because what you can imagine is that through these deep learning type of perspectives, you can actually lift like objects, on your sensory data to this kind of a space. Then on the other side, you can squeeze like really precise symbolic expressions also to this space, right? So you can actually do a lot of search and this kind of combination in this intermediate space. So I think because it's nice properties, this intermediate space is very interesting. And also, this is a little bit related to consciousness. So I'm very happy. I'm very impressed by this temporal spatial theory of consciousness by George Nothoff at Ottawa. And basically, what he's actually a neurosurgeon, so he gives people anesthetics and observe different brain states, right? So he has a lot of first-hand experience. And what he emphasizes is that actually, if you look at normal levels of consciousness, you have actually collaborations and this nestedness of these waves at different scales, right? And if you get anesthetized, you lose this consciousness. Actually, these oscillations still remain, but they're just out of sync, right? So you lose the long-range correlations of these kind of oscillations, right? I mean, in relation with also the kind of the statistical observations on the last slide, I think really the intermediate state somehow got you into kind of a domain where you can have minimal associations across the different scales. And finally, I just want to say that this balance between spontaneous activity, which is kind of like your resting state, your mind wandering, right? And I argue this is a little bit like what current large language model does, right? It generates all kinds of hallucinations. It's probably a little bit similar to this state. And the other state, right? You have working memory solving these math logical problems. So you have a lot of very strong control over the states. It's very precise. But actually, it's really in the middle, right? Where you have creativity, for example, alternative uses and remote associations of words, etc., meanings. That's really the holy grail. And I think that probably related to many properties on the intermediate levels. Okay, with that, I would like to acknowledge the graduate students and our funding agencies. And really, finally, really thank you for sticking to the end with me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this beautiful talk,
Thank you.
which was perfectly in time. Thanks. So, talk is open for questions. Please.
Yeah, hi, Robert Legenstein from TU Graz. Thank you for a nice talk. You talked about plasticity and learning, and then about rules and inference. So, in how far do you think that some rules might be innate and not really learned in the brain?
That's a very good point. My feeling is that, my belief, right, I don't know the final answer, but it's probably that you have this, for example, if it's like a reflex, of course, then you have, but I wouldn't call that like a really rule. I think for rules, it's really more like these kind of constraints that are, in a sense, innate, and that then enables you to actually learn these rules.
Yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. My name is Timo Oster from TU Darmstadt. And I was wondering on the slides that you have shown about how people can really precisely guess the correct 0-1 sequence. Are we people rewarded for finding the simplest rule? Because I think the simplest rule is what is giving, what is taking the least resource to save in our brains. Are
Yes.
machines rewarded in the same way, or might this be why machines are so bad at abstracting to really simple ideas?
Yeah, yes. I think the bottleneck I talk about is related to that idea, right? I would say maybe not so much just to save resources, although that might be important. But I think the major perspective is actually to generalize to novel situations. That's really what drives people to kind of break it down to simple elements and build everything else as simple combinations of these elements. I think that perspective, that drive is just not put in our current even large language models. And I propose we need to put in a constraint like that. And as I show in this simple situation, it helps a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Balazs from the Uni of Sussex. Thank you for the talk. And I was interested, I was just trying to make a connection between the more cognitive part and the neuromorphics. And since in all of these cognitive tasks, like the concept of having relatively complex whatever data structures and picking the few bits and pieces that we need to solve this task appeared at a few places. I was wondering if you think the SNNs could be, like the way that SNNs work, it could be exploited somehow for these cognitive tasks.
Yes, so this is what I alluded to in the talk, right? As you might know, that this vector symbolic architecture is really compatible with SNN. You can easily implement it on neuromorphic chip because it just uses high-dimensional vectors, right? So I think if we put in these kind of rules that you use to manipulate symbols, that's also kind of bottlenecks in this kind of work, right? And as I can show, maybe on this large-scale network, you don't need backprop. You just use what I talked about in the first place. Might be even enough to learn this really high-dimensional vector combinations. So I think with the Habbing and the reward learning, I think if I speculate a bit, I think that might lead to a new paradigm. Might be in some ways equivalent to backprop, but a slightly different perspective, right? Then you can build up a whole stack based on Habbing learning and reward and these high-dimensional vectors. So I think there is a pathway forward going that way.
Okay, there seem to be no further questions, so let's thank Zhensong once again.